Good morning, friends. This is Dr. Vipul Kapoor again. I welcome you all for our next lecture on poetry and its relation with philosophy. Friends, William Henry Hudson has written the critical book called An Introduction to the Study of Literature, and in chapter number 3 of this book, Hudson has discussed poetry. Poetry, the nature of poetry, the elements of poetry, the types of poetry, and how poetry is related to philosophy. Actually, poetry and philosophy are the two different branches of knowledge, but at the same time, poetry and philosophy both are considered as the ancient branches of knowledge. Poetry is as old, as ancient as philosophy is. And in one way or the other, you know, poets are doing what the philosophers are doing. At one point, somewhere, the function of poetry and the function of philosophy come to the singular point where we can say that the job of philosophy is sometimes done by by poetry. But still there are some differences between poetry and philosophy, because poetry is an art which opens up our eyes to the sensuous beauties and the spiritual meanings, right? Not only this, it is also said that poetry reveals life, and that is what we want to discuss today, the power of revelation of poetry, how poetry reveals life as it is and life as it ought to be, life as it should be. The relations of poetry to life is very unique since the beginning. Poetry is an art which cultivates all our faculties, whether it is a faculty of mind or it is a faculty of heart. It affects our outward as well as our inward personality as a whole. Poetry does not discuss only about the life as it appears from outside. It also at the same time discusses and expresses the life from inside. So you can say that poetry has both these functions to reveal, to express the inner life of mankind and the outward life of mankind. It appeals to our intellectual intellect as well as our emotions. In human life, our human existence has two important faculties. One is the faculty of thinking, that is the faculty of intellect, and the other one is the faculty of feeling, that is the faculty of heart. And poetry is an art which appeals both our faculties of thinking and the faculty of feeling. Okay, it appeals our it appeals our intellectualism as well as our emotionalism. Poetry reveals our power at every stage and in every phase of life. With the help of poetry, we can remove our blindness to the world of human experience and of nature, of human nature. Sometimes we are blinded to some people. I'm not talking about the physical, literal blindness, but sometimes we cannot see the reality, or sometimes we cannot understand the deeper meaning of human nature, of human existence, of human life. In such cases, it is poetry which helps us to understand life in a better way, to understand the complexities of human nature, to understand the deeper meanings of our human existence. So, the basic function of poetry, you can say, is to enlighten the people. It enlightens us, and not only that, poetry enhances our knowledge about the world, about the societies, about the cultures, and about human life. Poetry makes us aware. It imparts us some knowledge about the world. So the task of poetry is very serious and important, because poetry delights the reader. Fine. Poetry imparts pleasure to the readers. Fine. But only delighting and giving pleasure is not the only function of poetry. More than that, poetry has a very serious job to do in the society. It has the power to change the whole society, to change the whole nation, to change and shape the mind of the people. Okay, so it has a serious job to do. Why and how it is done? It is done by the poets, because great poets have that divine vision to see beneath the things. Beneath means under. Some ideas are hidden. In some cases, when we see the things, we see it apparently, or we see it from outside. But the poets are such great philosophers who can see beneath the things, beneath the ideas. And this is done by the poets through their divine vision. Because if somebody wants to be a poet, he or she must have that divine vision, and that divine vision helps the poet to interpret life in a deeper manner. The true poet, according to Hudson, possesses the power of seeing and feeling the sensuous beauty and the spiritual meaning of the things. Here, Hudson talks about two things. He says that the true poet has the power of seeing, number one, and the power of feeling, number two. Seeing what? Seeing the sensuous beauty, that means the external beauty of the world. Say, for example, a poet sees the beauty of nature. A poet sees the beauty of an ocean and writes a poem on the ocean. Okay, so how sensually it affects his senses, his sense of vision, and how beauty comes out from that scene. That is described by the poet. That is the outward job done by the poets. But at the same time, the true poet, according to Hudson, possesses the filling, the power of filling what? Filling the spiritual meanings. So the poets, you can say, bring about the hidden meanings or the spiritual meanings out of a physical object of this world. So there are two layers, you can say, the connotative and the denotative. Denotative meaning is the meaning that we receive externally. When we see some object, we get some meaning or we get some understanding. That is called a denotative meaning. And this denotative meaning is conveyed by the poets in their poetry. But at the same time, the poets have the power to see beneath. That's what just now I told you before some time. That they have the power to see beneath the things. And through this power, the poets they fetch out some spiritual meanings out of the things. And these hidden meanings are known as connotative meanings. So the poet plays two roles to do two jobs in his poetry. The poets have the job to convey the denotative meaning, the superficial meaning, and the poets also have the job to do where they convey the spiritual meanings, or you can say the connotative meanings. Okay, so Coleridge, S.T. Coleridge, a romantic poet, he also believes that the poet renders a great service to the mankind by awakening our senses and enlightening our spiritual self. So here, you can say that Coleridge also believes that the poets are not the common man. Poets, according to Coleridge, are some great philosophers because they have some serious job to do in the society for the mankind. They provide us, they render us a great service by doing what? By awakening our senses and by enlightening our spiritual self. Poetry teaches the mankind, poetry teaches the readers how to fetch the spiritual meaning of life. Life is presented by the poets, fine, but the life is presented in such a manner that the meanings come out from our reading of that life. And that is what, according to Coleridge, is the job of a poet. Okay, let's take another poet and critique, Carlyle. Carlyle also says that the poets have the power to bring about godlike mysteries of the universe. There are so many mysteries of the universe, but according to Carlyle, the poets have the power to bring about meanings out of these godlike mysteries of the universe. So, all in all, whether we talk about Coleridge's idea or we talk about Carlyle's idea, both are of the view that the poets have a very serious job to do to enlighten the spiritual senses of the people and to awaken the sensuous beauty which is there, the sense of beauty which is there among the people, among the readers. Even, if I take the example of William Wordsworth, Wordsworth also compares the poets with the priests. Priest, priest. There is no difference between the poet and the priest according to Coleridge. What does the priest do? The priest teaches some sermons in the church. The priest teaches some moral lessons to the society, to the people in the church. And according to Wordsworth, poets are as good as the priests. Poets also teach something to the society, something to the readers. They convey some moral messages to the readers. So, taking the examples from taking the views of Coleridge, Carlyle, and Wordsworth, we may come to the conclusion that yes, there is a relationship, a strong relationship, a strong bond between poetry and philosophy. Because poetry educates us to look at life with more of a poet's insight, and poetry, you know, enhances our comprehension of the world and society. We understand the society, the world, the human nature in a better manner. You know, it is done through this poetry. It, there are some latent faculties which are there, some latent, or you can say the suppressed emotions, the suppressed knowledge of the world which is there in us, and that is, given the flame by the true poetry according to Coleridge, Carlyle, and Wordsworth. At almost every point, poetry covers our relationship with life, because poetry is nothing but the reflection of life. It appeals nearly our all moods. Our sense of poetic beauty is awakened by poetry. The poetry touches the things with the charm which in itself, is a beautiful thing. Poetry can be an interpretation of life through the imagination and the feelings. Its greatness must be judged by the greatness of its powers. And what powers? It is the power, number one, to please the readers. Number two, the power to convey the moral messages. And that is why we come to the discussion of the function of poetry when we are discussing the relationship of poetry with philosophy. We must look at the function of poetry, because through this only, we come to know about how poetry is related to philosophy. Because most of the times, the scholars, the critics of English literature believe that poetry delights the reader, that poetry gives pleasure to the readers. And some other critics believe in the theory of art for art's sake. They believe that poetry has no function to do at all. They believe that art is not for anybody's sake. Poetry is not written for the readers, neither it is written for the society. So some scholars believe that poetry has no function at all. But it is a vague idea. This doctrine or this theory is very vague and shadowy. So, to understand it in a better manner, we must say that to teach is also an important function of poetry. To bring about moral awareness among the people in the society is also an important function of any serious poetry. let me recollect the views given by Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold has also said that poetry at bottom is a criticism of life. I repeat it again. Matthew Arnold says that poetry at bottom is the criticism of life. So, what does the poet do? The poet observes the society and he tries to present his own comments, his own criticism on life in his literature, in his poetry. Okay, so poet's job is very serious. Let me give you another example from a very famous poet Omar Khayyam. Omar Khayyam also said that let us make up in the tavern for the time we have wasted in the mosque. Here he says that what the religion cannot do, poetry can. The job which is not done even by the mosques or the temples, that job is very well done by the art of writing poetry. And that's why he says, let's make up in the tavern for the time we have wasted in the mosque. He says that the people waste their time going to the mosque and praying to God, going to the temples and praying to God. On the other hand, what we should do is let's go and sit in the tavern and let's talk about poetry, because poetry is something, which does what religion sometimes cannot do. So, taking this example of Omar Khayyam, also we can say that poetry is a very serious branch of knowledge. It is also said that a poetry of revolt against moral ideas is a poetry of revolt against life. That means what? The poetry which does not convey the moral ideas, which does not express the moral values, then that poetry is not a poetry at all. That poetry is against the life itself. Coleridge, again let me come back to Coleridge, and Coleridge also said that no man was ever a great poet without being at the same time a profound philosopher. So according to Coleridge, every great poet must be at the same time a profound philosopher. Emerson, again another thinker and a critic of English literature, he also believes that the great poets are judged by the frame of mind they induce. What kind of thinking attitude the poets have, that decides whether they are great poets or not. If the poets are having the serious bent of mind, you may consider those poets as the great poets. There is another critique called Landor. Landor says that a great poet is he who has treated a great subject worthily. I repeat it again. A great poet is one who has treated a great subject worthily. So, here Landor goes one step ahead and he says that the poets are not only supposed to talk about the great subjects in poetry, but at the same time these great thoughts, these great subjects, these great ideas must also be treated in a great manner, in a worthy manner. And such poets are considered the great poets, and such poetry is considered the great poetry. Robert Browning, a 19th century poet, he also is of the opinion that philosophy should be conveyed through poetry. Browning, a very well-known poet of the Victorian era of English literature, he also says that poetry and philosophy cannot be separated from each other, because philosophy, according to him, must be conveyed in serious art, in serious poetry. So, at the end of this lecture, we can say that a poet's greatness ultimately depends upon the greatness of his subject matter. How serious subject matter is taken up by the poet, that decides whether that poetry is great or not. The power of thought which is presented by the poets, that decides whether that poetry is great or not. And the moral strength and the moral influences which it exercises upon the society, that decides whether that poetry is great or not. You know, Walter Pater, another important critic of the Victorian era, Walter Pater also says that the greatness of literary art depends on the quality of the matter it informs and it controls. I repeat it again. He says that the greatness of literary art depends on the quality of the matter it informs and controls. So, Walter Pater also talks about the quality of the matter. What kind of a quality subject is taken up by the poet, that makes it a great work of art. So, in short, we can say that poetry, in the real sense of the word, serious poetry has a serious job in the society to do. Serious poetry has the power to bring about changes in the mind of the people, in the hearts of the people, and in the nation as a whole. And that's why serious poetry conveys moral messages, philosophical ideas. Poetry has the power to unleash or to express the hidden meanings, spiritual side of the things, that is shown by the serious poets and serious poetry. And that's why you can say that poetry has a great revealing power. So, friends, here we come to the end of this lecture on the relationship between philosophy and poetry, and the poetry's power of revealing in the society. Here we end up. Thank you. Thank you very much.